which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have touched, the word of life.
Welcome to the Amazing Collection. We are walking through the Bible, book by book. Have you ever had a time where you saw God's hand of protection on your life? When I was 26 years old, I became pregnant. I ate spinach and liver till it was coming out my ears. This was going to be the world's healthiest baby. Unfortunately, it wasn't a perfect baby. In fact, it had a severe birth defect. His stomach and entire intestinal tract were outside his body, and the doctor said he would die. That was a very traumatic time. But looking back, I can see God's hand all over that event. For example, the doctor who delivered the baby walked out of the delivery room right into a surgeon. Now, why was that man in that place at that time? But that man performed the first two surgeries that saved the baby's life. 8 months before this baby was born, I had asked Jesus into my life, and I was given the book of John. Why that particular book at that particular time? Well, I threw it on the nightstand and wrote telephone messages on it until this baby was born, and then I felt guilt. Was this my fault? I picked up that book of John and started to read, and there were people in there who had the same problem. The disciples said to Jesus, "Why was this man born blind? Was it because of his sins or the sins of his parents?" And Jesus said, "For no man sins, but to show the power of God." And God did that. He showed His power. He set me free. God had His hidden hand, His perfect timing, protecting us physically and protecting us emotionally and spiritually. When we come to the book of Esther, it's the 5th of the Post-Exilic Books. And as you look at the timeline, it's written right between the 6th and the 7th chapter of the book of Ezra. Now, in the first 6 chapters, remember we had the first return of the exiles. King Cyrus had made a decree that they could return. 50,000 did under Zerubbabel. And they rebuilt the temple. Then this book, this story takes place. It takes place between 483 and 473 BC. It takes place in Persia. So this is not telling us about the exiles who returned, but about the ones who stayed in Persia. Then we had the second return when Ezra came back and rebuilt the people. And then we had the third return when Nehemiah built the wall. If you turn with me to Esther chapter 1, verse 1. And this book can easily be broken down into two sections: the plots of men and the protection of God. And this would make a great movie. Hollywood would have a ball with this one because first we have a beautiful setting. The setting is the kingdom of Persia, and this was a big kingdom. The Persians had been conquering the world. They had conquered Israel, but that wasn't all. Their kingdom was so large. On a map today, it would go from Russia on the north, India on the east, Saudi Arabia on the south, and Greece on the west. It was a huge territory. And the palace itself was 300 acres large. Huge palace. In chapter 1, we are first introduced to the king. His name is King Ahasuerus, and he is throwing a banquet. It's quite a banquet. It lasts 180 days. Now that is a party. And as we read through this chapter, you find it's a very beautiful setting. It has linens and gold and silver and precious stones, and even the goblets that they drink their wine out of are made of gold. Very beautiful. If we were to look at the history, we would find that this king's father had attacked Greece and been defeated. And this king wanted to attack Greece. They wanted to conquer the world, and there were 120 provinces in Persia, so he had invited in all the leaders, and that's why he's throwing this banquet. He is trying to convince them that they should attack Greece. He's trying to impress them with his power and his riches. After a week of drinking, we come to chapter 1, verse 10, which says, "On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded his 7 eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful, but Queen Vashti refused." Now, it has been suggested by some commentators that he was in fact inviting her to come in only with her crown. Jewish tradition says that there was a disagreement or an argument among these men as to which of the provinces had the most beautiful women. After a week's drinking, I guess that's what men come up with. The king decided he would settle the argument by showing them how beautiful his queen was. We don't know why she declined coming. It says Vashti refused to come. Now, some people believe she would have come even if it was only with her crown, except she was pregnant at the time. Others, we don't know. We don't know what the reason was. We just know she refused. Now, this was very puzzling because this man historically is known as a man with a great anger problem, even when he hasn't been drinking for a week. Example. He had a bridge built over a body of water. A big storm came up and blew the bridge down. He had his men lash that water with 300 lashes. That'll show it. And then he had all the builders of the bridge beheaded. Now, this is kind of an irrational creature. And so we see that she said no, and he was disturbed, and his men say this will never do. His advisors say, in fact, if they hear what has happened here, the women will look with contempt upon their husbands. In other words, I don't want to go home and face my wife if they find out they can say no. So they propose that Vashti be banished from the kingdom, and she is. Chapter 2, verse 1 starts out, "After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti." And he's very blue. Well, now, apparently 3 years have passed between chapter 1 and chapter 2. And during those 3 years, this king actually did go and attack Greece, and he too was defeated, just like his father. So now he comes back from the battle, he's been beaten, and there's no queen to soothe his ruffled feathers, and he's lonely. And when his men see this, they say, "Oh, we've got to do something. Let's help him find a new queen. They propose a sort of beauty contest where they have the most beautiful young virgins in the provinces brought in for the king to find himself a new queen. Now, at first glance, this sounds like quite a deal. It was like a year at the spa. They had beauty treatments. They had oils and perfumes and their eyebrows plucked and special diets for 1 year. They were really going to look good. But it was 1 year's preparation for one night with the king. Now, I don't think any of these young women volunteered for this job because Josephus, the Jewish historian, says that 400 young women were picked. But 399 of them are not going to be chosen queen. And they can't go back home and get married and have babies. They're going to go into the harem. Now, if the king happens to remember them, they'll be called in to see him for a night or two. But they may never have a family. They may never have babies. I don't think these women volunteered. As a matter of fact, we're told then that there was in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai. Now, the word Jew is used 51 times in this book, and it comes from Judah. Jews were from the tribe of Judah. Of course, it is the Jews that we're dealing with now. The northern tribes of Israel have been assimilated or killed. But Mordecai had this cousin that he was raising. She was an orphan. Her name was Esther. And Jewish tradition says he tried to hide Esther. But apparently she was quite beautiful. They already knew about her, and she was one of these 400 brought in. But when her night came, the king looked upon her with favor. He took the crown and set it on her head and crowned Esther as the new queen. That brought Mordecai into a position in the kingdom, and he is now sitting at the gate. He becomes aware of a plot against the king. He tells Esther, Esther tells the king, and the two men plotting to assassinate the king are killed. Now, assassination was a true threat to kings in this day. As a matter of fact, it's believed that this king was assassinated some years later. Well, the king is saved, and they write down in the Chronicles this event that took place, that Mordecai had saved his life. Chapter 3, we have no story, no drama is complete, no movie without a villain. And we meet the villain. This book is divided into two parts, the plots of men and the protection of God. And here we start to see the plots of men. It says, after these events. What events? Well, we've had Vashti excommunicated, we've had Esther chosen as queen, and we've had Mordecai save the king's life. After those three events, the king promoted Haman, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes. And the people were supposed to pay homage to him. They were to bow to him. But we're told that Mordecai would not bow down. And when he was asked why, Mordecai said, because I'm a Jew. This made Haman very angry. And in the middle of verse 6 it says, therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai who were throughout the whole kingdom. Being a superstitious man, he took what we would call dice. They were called pur, and he cast pur. It was like lining up the stars to try to find out what the best day to do something would be. He was trying to figure out what would be the best day to kill all the Jews. It was in the first month when he, in effect, rolled the dice. And the date that came up was the 13th day of the 12th month. That is almost 11 months in advance. You see, God's in control of dice. It's God's timing. We have the plots of men, but we have the protection of God. So a decree is sent out As a matter of fact, look at verse 13 of chapter 3, because here's what it says. The letters were sent out, a decree from the king, to all the king's provinces that they were to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, and they were to seize their plunder. When Mordecai hears about this, he is distraught. He tears his clothes. He lays in sackcloth and ashes. He weeps and wails along with all the other Jews. When Esther hears in the palace that Mordecai is so distraught, she sends a messenger with a new set of clothes. But he won't put them on. He sends them back. She sends the messenger back to say, what's the problem? Mordecai sends a copy of the decree to Esther with a commandment that she go in and be an advocate before the king. Now Esther says, may I remind you that you just don't waltz in before the king. As a matter of fact, we know that the king was surrounded by men with axes. And if you came before the king and he didn't hold out his scepter to you, you got the axe. She knew that. She said, I haven't been invited into his presence for 30 days. But look what Mordecai said to her. Chapter 4, starting with verse 13. Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. First of all, he says, Esther, may I remind you, you're a Jew. The Jews throughout the province are going to be killed. You will not escape. I always thought that Mordecai wouldn't bow down to Haman because as a Jew, he wouldn't bow down to anybody but God, which sounds reasonable, except that they weren't asking for worship, they were asking for honor. And we know that Mordecai honored those in authority because he saved the king's life, didn't he? So that's not it. Remember how it said in chapter 3 that Haman was an Agagite? Well, if we compare Scripture with Scripture, we find that in the book of Genesis, Abraham had a son, Isaac, who had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Remember them? Esau was the non-spiritual one. He was the one who was so uninterested in spiritual things, he sold his birthright for a bowl of soup. Esau had a grandson, Amalek. When you come to Exodus and the people of Israel were being led out of Egypt to go to the promised land, the Amalekites attacked them and tried to kill or destroy them, tried to keep them from going into the land. And God said at that time, there'll be war from generation to generation between Israel and the Amalekites. We come to 1 Samuel. Remember when God told King Saul, I want you to destroy all the Amalekites. And he didn't do it. He saved King Agag alive. Now we come here and we see that Haman was an Agagite. Apparently, he was a descendant of the king of the Amalekites. Now we get the picture. These people were enemies of the Jews. God said they would be enemies from generation to generation. And we can see clearly, Haman didn't just hate Mordecai. He hated all the Jews. The decree was that every single Jew in all the province, which means every single Jew alive, would have been killed. But look what Mordecai says to Esther in chapter 4, verse 14. He says, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. In other words, Mordecai knows that God made Abraham a promise. And what was that promise? He'd be the father of a great nation. He would have land, and he would be the father of a descendant that would bless the world. He knows that all Jews are not going to be destroyed. Deliverance will come. This is our memory verse. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? That's a verse for you. Who knows whether you haven't been put in the neighborhood, in the school, in the church, in the workplace, in a specific place for such a time as this. Esther, after being assured she was there for such a time as this, says in chapter 4, verse 16, "Fast for me." Have you noticed that God's name has not been mentioned in this book? It's one of only 2 books that does not have God's name in it. And for that reason, some people have thought it shouldn't be in the Bible. But I think there are 3 good reasons why his name isn't here. Number 1, this is written in Persia. Now we can already see by the hatred of Haman that the Jews didn't have everybody like them. There was persecution. Even though the people in Persia had kind of melted in, they'd gotten good jobs, there was still some animosity against them. And I know that I write to a girl in another country today where there's persecution of Christians, and we write in code. I don't use the name Jesus in my letters. I think that's one reason. There could have been persecution. I think another reason is the purpose of this book is not to tell us what God said, but to show us God's hand, His hidden hand of protection on His people. The third thing is, His name really is in this book, 4 times in acrostic form. In the Hebrew, of course this is written in Hebrew, there are 4 sentences that either begin or end with the letters that make up the name Jehovah. So Jehovah's name is hidden 4 times in this book. She asks for them to fast for her. And she says, "My women and I will fast as well, and then I will go into the king." And then in the next verse, she says, "And if I perish, I perish." Fasting always has to do with praying in the Bible. It's not just fasting to keep from eating food, it's fasting in order to pray. Ezra 8:21 says that they were to fast, to humble themselves, and seek God, seek His face. So fasting was always to seek God, to pray. So she's saying, in effect, pray to God for me, and then I will go in. But she is so submitted, isn't she? If I perish, I perish. She knows about the guy with the axes, and she's willing to die. She goes into the king, and in chapter 5, he says to her, "What can I do for you, Esther?" He does extend the scepter, and she says, "I would like Haman and you to come to a banquet tonight." They do. They get to the banquet, and he extends the scepter again. "What can I do for you, Esther? I'll do it up to half the kingdom." And she says, "I would like Haman and you to come back for a banquet tomorrow night." And your first thought is, why the delay? Because we've had the plots of men and we have the protection of God. And God always gets His right people in the right place for the right time. Remember, it was for such a time as this. Timing is very important. I remember a time, Travis was 3 years old. He had survived 4 surgeries at that point. We were riding along a dark, windy road through a thick forest, and there was a logging truck in front of us, and being the impatient person that I am, I wanted to pass it. But my husband didn't. And just then, a big oak tree, tons, it weighed tons, fell on the back of that logging truck. 1 second sooner, it would have killed the driver. 1 second later, it would have crushed and killed us. The hidden hand of God, God's protection, the right timing. It's not the right time. Well, Haman goes out of that banquet and he is so excited. He runs home and he tells his friends and his wife, you know, I am so rich and I've got 10 sons. And the king has honored me. He's promoted me. I'm head over all the other leaders. And I got to dine with just the king and the queen. Nobody else was there. But look at chapter 5, verse 13. He says, yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the gate. Boy, anger really does spoil a fun day, doesn't it? And his wife, anger's catching. Zeresh, his wife, says, well, no problem. Tell you what you do. You build some gallows. And you go in first thing in the morning to the king, and you get permission to hang Mordecai on those gallows, and tomorrow night you can go to the banquet and have a good time. You see, anger and hatred is catching, isn't it? Have you ever had a great day and your husband came home in a bad mood and all of a sudden you're mean as a snake too? It's catching. Misery is catching. Well, we said it wasn't the right time. We've seen how God has been in control of timing. He was in control of the dice. The dice gave them 11 months to prepare for this destruction. Chapter 6, verse 1. The king could not sleep. And he gave an order that the book of the records, the Chronicles, be brought to him and to be read. I don't know if he ate too much chili at the banquet, if he had too much wine, or if God just kept him awake. Have you ever been kept awake? I always figure there's a reason for it, probably to pray. He is awake, and he could have invited in one of the women from the harem. He could have invited in musicians, but instead he invites in a man to read the Chronicles. And they would have said something like this: so-and-so performed a noble deed, and he was given a city. So-and-so performed a noble deed, and he was given a province. Mordecai saved the king's life, and nothing. And the king says, well, what was done for this man? And they said, nothing. So he goes running out into the court, and he runs into Haman, who is running in to get permission to hang Mordecai. And he says to Haman, what should be done for a man that the king wants to honor? And Haman thinks, who could the king want to honor more than me? So he thinks, what would I like Mordecai to do? I think that he should wear a robe, a royal robe that the king has worn, and ride on a horse that the king has ridden upon. And he should be led through the streets by a very important person saying, this is a man that the king wants to honor. And the king said, great idea, do it for Mordecai. Can you imagine poor Haman? This is what he wanted, and now he has to do it for his enemy? Well, he does it, and he gets home that night, and he tells his family and his friends what happened. Look at chapter 6, verse 13. It says he tells them what happened, and then in the middle of the verse it says, then his wise men and Zeresh his wife said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. And just at that point, the king's eunuch came to take Haman off to the banquet. Isn't that amazing? They say, if he is of Jewish origin, you're not going to win this battle. Remember what God said back in Genesis? I will bless those who bless my children and curse those who curse them. And even these Persians know that. They know that if this man is a Jew, they're in trouble. Well, Haman is now taken to the second banquet. It's not such a happy time, because soon as he gets there, the king extends his scepter and says to Esther, what can I do for you up to half the kingdom? And she says, this time, the truth. She says, save my life and that of my people. That's in chapter 7, verse 4. And then she actually quotes from the decree. She says, "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." See, those were the very words in the decree. And the king says, "Well, who would want to do this?" And she says, "Haman, that wicked Haman." And all of a sudden, the light has to come on for the king. He didn't know she was a Jew, but he doesn't hate Jews. This is his queen and he's loved her. He now finds out she's Jewish, but he loves her. And Mordecai the Jew saved his life. Why would he want to kill Jews? The light comes on. He has signed a decree, and decrees from the king were irrevocable. It could not be changed. Now he does something very uncharacteristic. He goes outside to cool off. Haman realizes he has no hope but to throw himself upon the mercy of the queen, and as he throws himself physically upon her, the king comes back in and says, "What? You going to assault the queen in my presence?" And just then the eunuch says, "You know, when I picked up Haman to come to the banquet, he had built some gallows for Mordecai." And the king says, "Good, hang him on it." You reap what you sow. Isn't that what the Bible says? We've had the plots of men. We've had the protection of God. We now have the enemy destroyed, killed. But we have a problem. We still have that decree out there. Remember, a decree cannot be changed. But the king promotes Mordecai and gives him Haman's position. He gives Esther Haman's goods, his money. So now they have the power and the means to send out a new decree, which they do. And this new decree in chapter 8, verse 11, says that the Jews have the right to assemble in order to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate, has the same terminology, anybody who would attack them, and they have the right to plunder their spoil. In other words, the Jews are given the right not only to defend themselves, but to take any material goods from anyone who would attack them. Chapter 9, verse 1 tells us that the very day that the enemies of the Jews thought they were going to win, they were in fact defeated. And that verse ends with the Jews gained the mastery over those who hated them. They were hated, and God protected them. We know that Haman's 10 sons were killed. Obviously, they were then people who attacked the Jews. We know that in the city of Susa, 800 people were killed. They had attacked the Jews. Across the province, 75,000 people had attacked them and were killed. That's a lot of hatred, isn't it? But the Jews did not take the plunder. They didn't want it to be said that we attacked them for their things. The Feast of Purim was established. Remember, they were called Pur or dice. Because this day that was supposed to be a day of death became a day of victory, the Feast of Purim was established, and that was to celebrate and remember God's hidden hand of protection upon His people. And it was to be remembered throughout all generations. They were never to forget. And even to this day, the Feast of Purim is celebrated. On the first day, they fast and read the book of Esther, and every time Haman's name is mentioned, they rattle rattles and shout, "Let him be accursed," or "Let his name be wiped out." On the second day, they feast, they celebrate, they exchange gifts. It's a day that they remember this event where God's hidden hand of protection was for them. Mordecai is elevated, and the book ends with him protecting and looking out for the welfare of his people. Now you might say, okay, I don't see Jesus in there exactly, because we always show how Jesus is concealed in the Old Testament, but He's our advocate. You know how Esther couldn't just barge into the king, and we can't barge into God's presence, the King of Kings, either. Jesus says, no one comes to the Father but by me. 1 John 2 also says that if we sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. He's our advocate. And God also made an irrevocable decree in the garden. He said, if you sin, you'll die. How many of us have not sinned? We've all sinned. Therefore, we'll all die. It's irrevocable. But God, in the same way, made a new decree when Jesus died on the cross. And that was, trust in the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. So the first decree was overcome by the second one. When I put my faith in Jesus as my advocate, I'll have enemies. But the promise is that His hidden hand of protection will be on us. Even when we can't hear His word, we'll see His hidden hand. And that's something to be celebrated, isn't it? I told you about how God protected Travis as a baby. A few months ago, he got married. And I'd like you to listen to his new bride, Maria, share how God's hidden hand of protection was working in her life as well.
Basically, my mom was in college, and she had gotten a summer job, and she met kind of this smooth-talking, handsome man who she thought was just Mr. Dream World, and they fell in love, and a year later they were married. And so she came home and she told him, I'm pregnant with our first child. I'm so excited, and I know we didn't plan this, but I think it's going to be a blessing to us. So he gave her an ultimatum. He said, either you have an abortion or I'm leaving. And my mom had grown up having faith in the Lord and knowing Him and knowing that abortion was wrong. She was trying to hold down 2 jobs and finish her school. And so my grandparents really played a big part in my life then, and I'm very thankful for them. My grandmother would sing me to sleep every night, and she gave me like a little Jesus nightlight, and she started telling me that she understood that I felt unsafe, and you know, she didn't want me to feel unwanted. So even in times when my mom couldn't be there because she was working, I had the reassurance of my grandmother loving me and praying over me every night and establishing that covenant between me and Jesus even before I was old enough to understand what that really meant. My mom was working and living in an apartment, and she met one of her neighbors, actually, a man who they had a mutual friend in common. And this man was wonderful to her. He loved me, and he asked her to marry him, and he asked if he could be my father, which was just an incredible blessing. My dad, that I was so fortunate to have and who had given me a wonderful childhood, came to see me in Atlanta, and I could tell by the expression on his face that something was really wrong. And he told me that he had stage 5 terminal liver cancer, and they had given him about 3 months to live. During this time, I really started to question God, because I just couldn't bring myself to face that my father was going to die. And I just started saying, God, why would you do this to me? You've been there for me my whole life. Why would you let this happen? I was angry at God. I didn't understand, and I was angry at Him. And I started a time period in my life that lasted about 2 years where I held on to that anger. And I started searching for something else that would give me the protection I wanted. And so I turned first to a guy I was dating, just kind of casually dating at the time. And I thought, well, I'm just going to really pursue this, and maybe I'll get married, and this will be the person for me. And really, I wanted to be the stand-in for my dad. And it was very hard on him, though, because my grief was so intense that I know I probably scared him to death, and I kind of pushed him away. So when that didn't work out, I remembered my grandmother, who had given me the foundation of my faith, and I started calling her and going to visit her and talking to her, and just saying, why would this happen? I don't understand. And we started building a bond with each other. 6 months later, she died of a massive heart attack. It was just like these doors shutting in my face all around me. So when she passed away, I went back to the person I was dating, and I said, look, I know I'm grieving, I know this is weird, but I think you and I have just got to work this out, and we're just going to trudge ahead, and we're going to get married, and this is going to be it. And he's like, okay, whatever. About 2 months after I was engaged, I found out that my fiance was unfaithful to me and had been for some time, and that relationship ended. I really just started breaking down inside. There was one night in particular where things kind of came to one terrible moment where I got out my Bible and I was ready to confront God. And I said, God, why? Why have you done this? Why did you do this to me? Why did you take these people that I loved and I cared about? And I just started reading the scriptures. And I said, if you've got something to say to me, God, I want to hear it, because I'm out of options. I have nowhere else to go. And the moment was so bittersweet because I was so hurt and so broken, but I was so willing to find any kind of hope anywhere. I started reading the Psalms, and I started reading the struggles that David went through in his life, and how he cried out to God, and how he said, God, I can't cry anymore. I have all my tears have wet my pillow there. I can't cry anymore. And I said, God, that's how I feel. Can you help me? Once I made that step of dedication, things began to look up. I met a wonderful Christian man who's now my husband of 6 months, and I couldn't be more blessed by him. And I also found a job that was so much more fulfilling than what I'd been doing before as a writer for a Christian magazine. And just as evidence of God using His protection and having His hand on me, now I'm using these stories to write to other people, to help them understand that there is hope after grief, there's hope after death. And our ultimate hope, of course, is eternal life, which is the greatest hope we can ever have in anything. And that's available only through Jesus. So my life's a testament to that.